Dr. Tamara Stenn. She teaches economics, entrepreneurship, and innovation in the professional studies department here at the college. She is bilingual, Spanish and English. She is an eco-business developer, sustainability trainer, fair trade business owner, Fulbright research economist, and author.
Great. Thank you so much. All right, so welcome everybody. If you don't mind, I just want to take one quick photo. So the farmers I've been working with are very happy that we're having a presentation today, and I get to report back to them how it went. So if you don't mind, I'm going to take a quick photo so I can show them who was here and what it looked like. Is that good? So we're videotaping this for BCTV, but in Bolivia they don't have very strong infrastructure sometimes, and it's hard to download an entire video, so they might not be able to watch it even if I send them the link. Oh yeah, and one other thing, as I took out my phone and took a picture, make sure that your phones have the volumes turned down, right? Good. All right, so we're here today. We're going to learn a little bit about what I've been doing for the last 3 years. I got a Fulbright scholarship to go and do research in Bolivia as an economist, looking at the well-being of Bolivian women. And at the time, quinoa was becoming a world food, a superfood. It was incredibly popular seed. How many of us knew what quinoa was before we came here? Nice. All right, for those of you who don't, try some in the back, and it's a little seed that comes from the Andes. So when I started my Fulbright, it was a boom economy. Everything was going great. And as soon as I stepped foot on Bolivian soil to start my research, the market fell out of the quinoa industry, and it's been on a downward spiral ever since. So my research has been really looking more at a question of the future of the Bolivian quinoa producers. And we're going to go take a look at what does that mean as their industry that they're working in starts to decline, and how do they understand that? So to get started, what I do is I made a quick video, and I'll play that for you, just to give you a little bit of the feel of the context, what the place looks like, how it sounds. Okay, there we go. So that gives you a little bit of a view, what it looks like, where it came from. It's an interesting grain working with quinoa because it is a product that has a very strong cultural value to it. And what was the most interesting is Bolivia has many products that have been exported out to other parts of the world. Potatoes came from Bolivia, tomatoes came from Bolivia, but only quinoa has the story where it was a gift from the gods. And what's interesting with that is when the gods, the story has it, when the gods gave the people the quinoa, once their inland sea dried up. Tanupa is also the name of a volcano, and there's a whole story about the volcanoes and how they communicate with each other. So the Tanupa volcano is also the Tanupa goddess and also the Tanupa maiden that danced around the shores of Lake Titicaca and enabled this quinoa to grow. And there aren't other products that have that story. And when the gods gave the quinoa to the Bolivians, they told them this is a food for humanity, and this is a food that's going to help to have people survive disasters. And so the Bolivians always felt a very strong a commitment to making quinoa available to the rest of the world. And that's kind of where the story begins. So quinoa is produced in Bolivia and South America. It's kind of in the center of South America. There's Chile and Peru is around it. It's produced at the edge of the Uyuni salt flats. Okay, and it's produced in soils that are very dry, very sandy. They're also magnetic. Okay, so here's a magnet, and here's the real soils from the quinoa fields. So I'm going to pass this around, and you can see what it is that they actually grow, and it's very rocky. And that high mineral content is what makes the quinoa so healthy, okay, because it absorbs all of those minerals from the soil. And it's also very drought resistant. If we look at what the salt flats look like, this is the Salar of Uyuni. Has anyone ever been here? It's a great tourist attraction. Okay, I know Muzi has, my daughter, because she helped me film everything. So here they actually mine salt. It's one of the largest lithium deposits in the world. Okay, Bolivia as a country has a very strong commitment to ecology, so they haven't really commercialized the mining of the salt flats yet. A lot of countries want to go in there, but they've been kind of holding back. So what is quinoa? It comes in 3 different varieties, more or less. There's actually over 55 varieties, but we know them as the 3 colors of white, red, and black. There's also flakes and flour. And it's very high in energy. It's one of the only seeds that has a full complex protein like meat, except it's not meat. They're growing quinoa on Mars right now because it's resistant to radiation. It actually needs radiation to grow. So on the salt flats, there's a lot of radiation. It's very high altitude, and it's white. It's very reflective. So there is a lot of ambient radiation that helps the seeds to mature. It also has a lot of antioxidants, and it's good for digestion, and it has a lot of really amazing properties. Okay? And what I'm working with is something called royal quinoa. So the quinoa that grows around the salt flats is actually superior to other quinoas because of the soils, and it's also its native land. So the seeds are actually a little bigger, a little creamier, and they have more protein content. Okay, so this is what we're working in, this idea of royal quinoa. And this is what was going on. So here's the economic story. So back in the day, 1990 and beyond, quinoa wasn't worth very much. In fact, it was hardly even sold in the markets. It was mostly produced just for personal consumption. And it was grown in a region where nothing else would grow. They couldn't grow potatoes or wheat or even raise sheep. They had llamas, and they had quinoa. So the market was $830 for a ton of quinoa. Okay, so a lot of product, very small price. By 2014, though, there was a huge amount of development being directed towards the quinoa, so international development. So Bolivia is one of the poorest countries in South America. Okay, so it's underdeveloped. So a lot of countries like to go and spend money and nonprofits to help the underdeveloped countries to develop more. Okay, and the farmers in Bolivia were the poorest of the poor because they lived out in the areas where there wasn't any industry and there wasn't a lot of other opportunities. Okay, they could grow their own food, which was quinoa, and eat llama, and that was pretty much their livelihood. So they were targeted for development. It was discovered the properties of quinoa. It was being there was a lot of foreign investment into that, and suddenly by 2014, the United Nations declared this is the year of the quinoa. And there's a huge international recognition of quinoa as a superfood, and that's probably when it started coming onto your radars. Right now you can get quinoa in the dining hall. There's quinoa everywhere. Okay, but back in the day there wasn't. with that, the prices got higher. And the reason why the prices got higher is the farmers that grow the quinoa, there's thousands of small farmers, okay? And most of them have about 20 acres of land, which is something, okay? But here, you're in the vast salt flats, so 20 acres in comparison to everything, isn't a huge amount of land. And it's really hard to grow on that land, so they don't always have all 20 acres in cultivation. They usually only have about 12. And then that helps them to rotate the crops because also the lands are very delicate, and you have to be careful not to grow too many things there at once, else you'll ruin the soil. So what happened was, as the world was taking notice and wanting to buy quinoa, the farmers were forming cooperatives. And they were selling the quinoa in cooperatives in their own rural markets, and they kept raising the prices themselves because nobody else had quinoa. Bolivia was the world's #1 producer of quinoa for a period of time. So they could control the prices. They saw everyone wanted it. They were smart. They rose the prices 20% every single year because they could, and people would pay it. And then by the time they got to $5,000, everyone said, whoa, this is something to invest in. And they all started growing quinoa too. And that's what ended up with the market collapse, because now there was competition. The government of Peru invested millions of dollars into helping to develop agro-industry around quinoa. And a lot of countries now, China, France, even Malawi is doing amazing work with agro-industry and growing quinoa in large scales with lots of machineries. And the seed is very adaptable and can grow in many different environments. But it's not royal quinoa. It'll be a lower quality, but people don't really understand the difference yet. Okay? So that's kind of our quinoa story. So those of you who are in my economics and marketing classes, supply and demand, right, we had a glut of supply. Okay, there was so much quinoa on the market, it lost its value in prices. Everyone could just get quinoa from their own countries, and the Bolivians were losing out. And that was when my research started. Okay, so what does that look like? Well, first of all, for economics, we all have economies, right? Here in Vermont, we have our own way of realizing our well-being. So to be able to figure out what was going on in Bolivia, I had to find a good research method. So I learned about this project called the Circles of Sustainability, which some of you have studied with me already. And we actually did a sustainability project here in Putney last year. And what this study does is it helps the people within the region to define their own well-being using a survey and having them respond. How do they think their economic well-being is? How do they feel their ecology is? What's their culture like? Okay, and with the survey, they answer on a scale of, in this case, I think it was 1 to 7. The 1s are the reds, right, and the 7s are the most robust. Okay, so we can collectively analyze everybody's results and see, well, how are people feeling in a particular situation? And the reason why I use this method of research is because if I use the traditional economic methods of per capita earnings or infant mortality rates or rates of education, it wouldn't really get to the essence of what was happening in the quinoa region. So I wanted to know from the people how they were feeling, because these already were the farmers that were living on close to $2 a day, which is the level of the international poverty rate. Except I knew that these farmers were not impoverished, okay, but they also didn't have a lot of opportunities. So an example of how the survey worked, we'll go and do one question. Okay, so we would ask people their opinions, any person, okay, that lived in that region. So here's one, and let's see how we would do here. How do we understand our own economic world? So if I was to ask you guys the opportunity to improve one's economic life, okay, right here in the context of where we are, how do you feel your future is? Is it very bad, bad, okay, good, or excellent? So get ready to raise your hands. How many of us think it's very bad right now? Ah, that's good. How about bad? How about okay? Okay, well, we're trucking along, something could be happening. How about good? Nice. Very good. All right, okay, so we got a pretty optimistic crowd here. That's how the people in Bolivia felt too. Even though if I had done a traditional economic analysis, I would have labeled these people as impoverished. But they weren't feeling impoverished. Even though the market was declining, the 3 years that I was there, every year the market was worse and worse and worse. But the people were still feeling kind of hopeful about it. Okay, so if we look at the results, I had 392 surveys, and the way I did them was I worked with school students. I worked with seniors in high school and also college kids who were home on vacation. Because a lot of these quinoa families, after they made their big bucks with the quinoa, the first thing they did was send their kids to college. Now in Bolivia, college is free, But if you live far away in the countryside where it's a 4-hour bus ride just to get to the city, you need cash for the bus ride, you need a place to stay in the city, and you need a little bit of money to pay for your books and supplies, plus you're not working. So you need a family that can afford to have you not work and have a little bit of extra income to afford your upkeep while you're in the city studying at these free schools, okay? So it's not always so easy. So the first thing the farmers did was they sent their kids to school. And during summer vacation, which is in December when I was in Bolivia, the kids would come back, okay? Because they'd be helping their parents on the farm, and they would help me do the surveys as well. So the surveys were done by the people in the communities. Why? Because I wanted to have people that the community trusted, that understood their language. The people that I work with speak Spanish, but they mostly speak Quechua and Aymara. Okay, they're indigenous people, and that's their first language. A lot of the people speak 3 languages. How many of us here speak 3 languages?
I'd say 2.
Pretty cool, pretty cool, okay? So here we have people who are technically illiterate. A lot of them were labeled illiterate, but they could speak 3 languages fluently, okay? So I had the surveys done. So if we look at the results, economics, yes, we have that orange square in there, right? This is the combination of all 3 years because they were feeling that pressure, right? As the market continued to decline so strongly, it was squeezing them. But they were still feeling kind of in the middle, okay? For their ecology, they weren't feeling as excited as they had in the beginning. There was a decline because when there was the big quinoa boom, everyone was growing quinoa and they had money. So they were buying tractors and they were buying cars and they were all just going out to the countryside. There was reverse migration. A lot of the families already had family members that had left and were living in Chile. They were living in Spain. They were living in Argentina, working in factories as housemaids, as gardeners, you know, informal economy. These were undocumented workers. And they all came back to Bolivia with the quinoa boom because they could make more money on their own home farms. They also brought back all the technology and new ideas that they learned living in these other countries, which were much more developed. So they started really developing the quinoa lands quickly, and the lands, remember, they're delicate. They didn't do too good. So there was a lot of erosion. There's been a loss of llamas, a loss of wildlife. It's not a disaster, but it's not great. Okay, so that's where the ecology comes in. Culture, people feel robust. They feel respected. They've had an indigenous president for almost 10 years who's really done a cultural revitalization. And as far as politics, one question I left out of the survey because it didn't really fit in the Bolivian context, so that's why there's a blank. But in general, people were feeling a little bit nervous. Their president had been a president for a long time, and people were nervous that there might not be a movement for a change in government or new ideas to come in. They were starting to feel a little bit repressed, a little squeezed, a little nervous, and that was starting to come out. So what happened after the boom? If we take a look at all of the different consequences, right? We had the desertification and erosion, which is what I talked about. Communities got renovated, right? There was money so people could rebuild old houses that were falling down. People bought SUVs so they could get to the countryside. There's urban migration, so everyone that had those rural farms went and bought an apartment in the city, bought a house. Usually they bought an apartment in the city. Some of them bought a storefront so they could start other businesses. A lot of people bought trucks so they could then rent out their trucking and start bringing products around the different areas of the country, a new way to earn income. They diversified their family earnings, okay? And they stopped cultivating so much quinoa. There's a 20% reduction in the cultivated areas. And the villages became abandoned because once the prices went down, everyone moved to their city houses. And there became a new distinction now. You had the estantes, which was the people that sometimes would come out and visit in the communities. And then you had the residents, which was the people that lived there all the time. So all communities have annual festivals and holidays, and there's also a very strong political environment that's democratic, and everyone has to be available to vote and to participate. So all the people come in from the cities when those times happen, but those are the residents. Then they all go back. Okay, and because of that, there's no one in the hospitals and the schools anymore because the kids are going to the hospitals and schools in the city. And then the 50% that are still in the rural areas are suffering. Okay, and we also have less llamas. Why do you think we have less llamas? What does that have to do with anything? Yeah, Megan, what do you think?
Maybe because of the population kind of just shrinking, at least people kind of moving back to the area, and then also with the issue of erosion, perhaps it's taking them away in a sense.
Yeah, right. There's less wild forage for them to eat, and there's less people sticking around to take care of them. So there's a whole new economy that opened up where people started paying the families that did stay, the residentes, to take care of their llamas for them, because no one could take care of their herds if they weren't there anymore. And that was sort of a safety deposit account for people to have those extra animals, because you can always slaughter them for money. Also, the llama manure is very important for growing quinoa. It's the only fertilizer that works on those delicate soils. And there is a huge growing market now for llama manure, especially as there's less llamas. All right, so what happened? So that's one story, right? So we did some surveys. But then also the women, right? I like to study the women. And if you go into a community, who always comes up and talks to you first? What do you think? The men, right? There's always some guy there telling you what's going on, okay? So to talk to the women, I actually had to set up special meetings and explain that this was a women's meeting and that women were here to meet together. And sometimes the men would come anyway because they said, well, it's our culture to work together and we want to be here in this meeting. So with the women's permission, some guys would also come. But it was really about the women. And what I was asking them is, what does sustainability mean to you? Right? So understanding what's happening behind these survey questions. How are they understanding their own environment? And we did this with a Native American tradition called the talking stick. So each person that had a stick that was passed around in a circle would have to speak. Okay? And as they spoke, I would capture what they were talking about with pictures, because not everybody would be able to read and write easily. Okay? And a lot of them, Spanish was not their first language. So after listening to the women and categorizing what they were saying, you guys get to learn some Spanish. Okay, so here we have temas de importancia. What do you think that might mean? Yeah, sort of themes, important themes. Okay, so we have these important themes. The way that the women speak in Bolivia, a lot of times it's a positive, negative. They balance their conversations. So if they're going to criticize something, they're also going to come up with something good about it. It's called chachawarmi, and it's a way of balancing opposites. So when they were talking about climate, they would be talking about things that were bad, but also things that were good. And what we can see here is from 2015 to 2017, there's certain things that started bothering people a little bit more. So in the beginning, the climate was of concern, and then it became of a very big concern as that erosion really started to take hold. And there was also climate change was impacting people. So the rain patterns were different. The hail was different. It was affecting the crops. Gender was a big thing. Men and women are supposed to work together, except the women noticed that, yeah, we're working together in the fields, but we still have to cook for everybody and clean up after everybody and take care of all the kids. And now we're sharing this quinoa work in the fields. That's actually not so even. And because they were working with fair trade, and fair trade has a model that has a requirement of gender equality, people were starting to talk more about that. How can we be more equal? Quinoa, they were happy that they had it, but they were sad about the prices of it, but they were also happy about the nutritional value that they were seeing. The land was becoming a little bit of a problem as it was starting to get used up or not cared for well. The herds, that was a new thing that people were starting to feel bothered by the lack of the herds. In the beginning, that wasn't an issue. By 2017, people were noticing. And then the economy was interesting. In 2015, everyone was all aflutter. By 2017, they kind of got used to it. And it really wasn't so much of an issue, even though it had been getting worse and worse. Okay? So when we're looking at positive and negative changes, okay, so these are the things that have been getting significantly worse. And this was very interesting for the Bolivian government to see, because the Bolivian government was under the idea that people in the Quinoa region were doing great, because they were exporting millions of dollars of product and they had these whole brand new international markets. But when you start really delving in and looking underneath the numbers, it wasn't exactly like that at all. So this was very interesting because the Ministry of Rural Development took notice of this and started to think about how can they do things differently. So market access, as it gets bigger, it's worse, right? So they're harder problems to get into those markets. Loans, people started taking out loans that they couldn't pay. wildlife. They're noticing a disappearance of wildlife, and also the economic production of quinoa is becoming more and more difficult. Okay, so what's the future then, right? What's the future of the women, the producers that are working in this whole thing? Okay, so if we take a look at the way I did this, you'll see some of the data says observations, right? So we have surveys, we have the women talking in groups and workshops. There would be 2-hour workshops I would host. And then we also had observations. So to observe, I would live in the quinoa communities. Okay, so I would go to the towns, go to the women's houses, go out to the very remote places where even our cell phone didn't know where we were anymore, and stay with the women, okay, and see, well, what is the life like, and work with them in the quinoa field. So this is Otuyo, which is in Oruro, and this is Quiacas. And actually nobody lives there in Quiacas. It's an example of an abandoned family community. The people now live in the town, and they'll just drive out there to work with their llamas. Those are their llamas. So far, so good. Everyone's with me? Almost there? All right, so here we have some of the other folks, right? This is Matilda, and she's in Quiacas, Oruro. Her kids are in college. Okay, she lives in the city. She came in for the weekend. Okay, she was checking on her quinoa fields. Here you can see some of the weeds that she's cut down. So she has to go and hoe her fields, right? The quinoa grows for 9 months, and it's a lot of work to get those plants to produce. So you have to make sure that you're taking care of the fields, that there's no animals that are eating the plants, there's no droughts, there's no frosts. Okay, so she's out there working with the quinoa. People also hand clean the quinoa. So the little teeny tiny seed heads, you have to knock the seeds out of them. Then you have to scrape them up. You saw the feet dancing, right, cleaning that quinoa. And then this is winnowing. So he's letting the wind blow the chaff, right, the outside seed case off the quinoa, and then the other heavy quinoa seeds being collected down on the bottom by his wife. Okay, so we spent a day out there helping them clean quinoa. And here's another family. So this is summer vacation. All the kids were home from school. This is actually a family that lives in the community full time, and dad is the community leader. Okay, so he's the one that reports to the mayor and lets people know what's going on with development, and they're mountain quinoa farmers. So they do everything by hand. And the family was out there checking on the quinoa fields, okay, in the middle of the summer. And there's 20,000 families that are working with the quinoa. Okay, so we have the mountain communities where there are no tractors. Everything is done by foot, okay, carried by llamas, carried by donkeys. Okay, this is Miguelita. So 30% of the quinoa is hand-grown in the mountains. Right now, there's no distinction between what's mountain quinoa, what's not mountain quinoa. You guys are just sold something called quinoa. So this is an example of a factory processed from Bolivia, organic fair trade quinoa, but it's all the different varieties mixed together. It's mountain quinoa and also lowlands quinoa. And this I'm going to pass around. This is what the quinoa looks like before they clean it. Okay, so it has all its pretty little colors. You'll see those little pieces of stem in there. And then once this all gets cleaned off, it turns white. Okay, so the same quinoa. Here we go. Show and tell. All right, so now what we have is also this quinoa that's grown in the communities. Okay, and a lot of times these folks tend to have tractors. And they'll have tractors help them a little bit with getting the fields ready, but they still have to hand harvest the quinoa. Okay, and here I am, right? So participant observation, that's ethnographic research is the style of work I did. So there I am trying to take the weeds out of the quinoa. It's not as easy as it looks. There's some weeds I got out. Okay, here we have a little bunny rabbit had eaten the quinoa plant. Part of a development project gone bad. Some Spanish people brought over rabbits thinking it would be a good source of protein about 50 years ago. And the rabbits got loose. They kind of established themselves in the environment, and now they eat quinoa plants, and that's a big problem. Okay, didn't used to be there before. Okay, and they're looking for water, so they just cut off the stalk so they can suck the water out of the plant. But now that whole seed head has been killed, and that seed head usually has a pound of seeds. Una libra? I think it's a pound. Yeah, it usually has a pound of seed in one seed head. So that's a huge loss for the farmer. Okay, and this is some more of the views of what it looks like. So here we have quinoa planted alongside the road. There's the truck and the families out there working. Okay, so this is 70% of the quinoa comes from the plains on the shores of the salt flats. Then we have the market. Okay, so this is called the black market of Chayapata. And it's called the black market because it's not really regulated. It's regulated by the farmers. And back in the day of the quinoa boom, international organizations would have their offices in Chayapata, which used to just be a dirt road. Now they have paving stones. But, and they would every day announce what's the market prices for quinoa for the world. So the world prices were set right here. Now what happens is people come in with trucks and just kind of buy it. There's not a lot of control, so people might say it's organic or it's fair trade, but there's no real paperwork or anything tracing that. There's not a lot of control of quality, and it's not being sold with the guarantee of a cooperative. Okay? So that's why it's called the black market. People from Peru will come in and buy it. So a lot of people sort of are buying that quinoa. You get cheaper prices there, but people will sell their quinoa in that market if they need some money. My kid needs to go to school. I have to buy some school books. My mom is sick. She has to go to the doctor. I'll go bring a bag of quinoa down and sell it. Okay, so that's usually how the people will access that market. And then the rest of it is sold through associations and cooperatives. Okay, and those are sold to international buyers in a very professional way. Okay, so to export the quinoa, you have to industrially clean it. Okay, so that's some of the equipment, and Bolivia is the forefront in the world of developing quinoa cleaning equipment. Okay, but the rest of the world is caught up pretty quick, mostly from copying the Bolivians. But they have to thresh it and wash it and dry it, classify it. So that's how they figure out what color it is. They have optical sorters that can figure out what one's red and what one's black and make sure they're all uniform. So since I've been studying, here's the economics data again. I started in 2015 and studied from 2017, and I saw what was interesting is a steady increase in the quantity of quinoa being exported. Okay, so we had 32, tons? I don't know what it is. So anyway, so we had a lot of quinoa being exported, yes, 32,000 tons. And then we had $74 million in the price. But what's interesting in this is even though they're producing more and more, the price is going down. Okay, so even though they're selling more quinoa, they're selling it at a lower price. And they're actually selling it at a price so low now that they're losing money. Okay, and where do they export the quinoa? Most of it goes to the United States. That's that big blue corner. And then also it goes to the rest of the world, which is the green. The orange is France. The gray is Países Bajos. What's that? Netherlands, right? Those are the lower countries, Netherlands. Holland. Number 2 is Germany. Okay, and then number 2. And then 2.2, that's Canada. Okay, so those are the different countries that are buying the Bolivian quinoa. So USA is a big, big market for them. Okay, but we can see the price of the export of quinoa keeps dropping. It's dropped 18%, okay, in the last 3 years. But they're still producing it. So to give us a kind of a context of how this all works, we have a 20-foot container, like those big containers that you see outside sometimes, like, or on the back of trucks and all. You people know what I'm talking about? The shipping containers. So a 20-foot one, it cost $53,000 to fill that with quinoa in 2017. Each container was worth $53,000. They sold 1,300 containers in 2017, okay, which is an average of 115 a month, valued at $6.1 million. So all of these little tiny farmers working by hand in these remote fields collectively are really creating a huge amount of product. So it's a big industry. It's actually one of the top 3 industries in Oruro, along with their export of minerals. So here the cost of production, this is where we're starting to see a problem. Because even though the quinoa is being sold, it's Bolivianos por quintal, which comes out to 35 cents a pound for us. So that's what the farmers are selling it at. But what they're earning from that is only 14 cents a pound, okay, after they cover all of their costs to produce it. So 33%, 66%, 2/3 of the cost of their quinoa goes into making it, and then they recoup 1/3 themselves, 14 cents for a big bag that size, okay? The biggest cost is the fertilizer, the llama manure, and then also they need to plant it. There's a lot of labor there, fumigating it. They use all natural organic chemicals, and those are expensive. Harvesting it, a lot of handwork again, cleaning it, a lot of handwork. So they have to pay for labor, and they also do their own labor. And of course, their labor is not compensated. And then how does it get to us, right? So it's just a few pennies down there, right? But those few pennies really add up and make a huge difference. And for us, what we're finding is this little box of quinoa, which came from Bolivia, okay, just in the same region that we're talking about, was being sold at the Brattleboro Food Co-op for $7.17 for 1 pound of quinoa, okay? So of that price, if we were to break it down, 65 cents goes to the farmer, okay? 41 cents goes to the factory that processes it in Bolivia, right? There's always 2 levels of processing. $1.86 goes to the importer, the person that pays for that container to be filled and sticks it on the boat and brings it to the US and pays all the taxes and tariffs and import fees and everything else, and then needs to find a market for it where they sell it to the mayorista, okay, which is the wholesaler. The wholesaler marks it up by $2.60 because that's when it gets put into the quinoa box, okay? So in this case, Ancient Harvest is the wholesaler. So they're buying it from the person that imported it, which is Andean Naturals, and then they're putting it in their own box, okay, charging $2.60 to do that. Then it gets onto the shelf of the co-op, and the co-op has to mark it up another $1.65 to cover their costs until we get that 65-cent quinoa for $7.17, and the farmers only have 14 cents out of that whole story. So, not so easy, right?
How is this right?
Yeah, it's called supply chains. So how is that right? Okay, and that quinoa is fair trade, except the farmers don't feel like it's very fair. In fact, the fair trade price isn't covering their costs. So this is the price of, in January 2017, these were the official world prices of quinoa. So 1 ton of quinoa was, organic fair trade from Bolivia was $2,600. That's the fair trade price. Without the fair trade price, it was $2,350. Most of the fair trade quinoa isn't sold at the fair trade price because no one wants to pay it. So they'll just pay the organic price instead, and the farmers will just sell it because it's better than not selling it at all, because if they don't sell it organic, they have to sell it conventional, and that's only $2,000, $2,100. Even if it is organic, if they can't find a market for it, they'll sell it as conventional. And then you can go over to Peru, where they have the agro-industry government's supported production. It's only $1,900. Right? So if you're a quinoa company in the United States, do you want to pay $2,600 for something you can get for $1,900 over in Peru? Kind of looks the same. No one's going to know the difference. So that was the problem with the Bolivians. No one wanted to pay their price. And what I found out working with the farmers, the price they actually need to have is $3,454, which is close to what it was back in 2014. Who's going to pay that? So what we found is how, what do we find? Oh, that's just how quinoa is being exported. So most of it is being exported organic. Bolivia is one of the only countries in the world that actually has organic quinoa. And the main producers of quinoa in the world is Bolivia, Peru, and Ecuador. So a lot of countries are now developing their own quinoa industries, but not to export, just for their own use. Okay, but the exporters are Bolivia and Peru. So far, so good? All right, so here's the big story. So if you take a look at my economics students, okay, if we're looking at where's the richest and where's the poorest, right, in Bolivia, and what does that mean for the quinoa growers? So in Bolivia, this is how much people make a month. Okay, so think about that. In the Altiplano, which is the highlands where the farmers are, the poorer people, okay, tend to live on $122 a month for everything. Okay? Can any of us live on $120 a month? Be tight, right? It's like, yeah. Okay? If you're living on a farm and you're growing a lot of your own food, it might not be the end of the world, but you can't go to college, right? You can't take a vacation, you can't buy a car, you can't go to the doctor, right? But you can survive, all right? Then those same poor farmers, okay, so those are the poorer farmers. The middle of the road farmers are making $283. We're following the blue line. And then the rich farmers are making $511 a month, okay? If you look at that compared to the rest of Bolivia, because the farmers are poor, okay, there's other people living in the cities that are not as poor. Okay, if you look at the country average, that's our gray line. the poorer people in the country are making $290. Okay, and the richer people in the country are making $940 a month. So still $12,000 a year, you're a pretty well-off person in Bolivia. Okay, it's a different level of living. And in the middle, we're at $554. So the Bolivians who are in a fair trade environment, they're making a little more than the medium income of the people in the countryside, right? They live in that countryside. They're at $316, not too bad, okay? But still way below the national average, right? $554. And if we were to pay them the dignified wage, which is the amount that they feel like they need to have to be able to afford to send their kids to college, save for their retirement, and have a decent life, they need to be making $673. So that's 43% less than what they're currently making at a fair trade price. Okay, and it's only 11% more than someone who's not working in fair trade is making. So that's where we have the problem. We're almost done, guys. So what's the future going to be? So I'm working now, so my research ended. So now I'm working now to develop a cooperative where we're looking at how we can start creating new opportunities and get in on that high-end market, because it's actually not that high, right? It looks like big money, $3,000 for a ton. But that comes out to be like an extra 50 cents a pound here in the United States. So when you look at the numbers, I feel like there's something that can be worked with. So we're starting to form a cooperative now. People are welcome to come on board and help us out. It's called the Perfect Seed. Okay, and what we're doing is we're working with hand-grown, slow-farmed quinoa and also other crops. Because there's a lot of people that have the same story where they're making these very special crops that have a very close cultural tradition that's blessed, that has a history to it and a folklore and a story and incredible nutritional value, and it's not being valued, right? And the products that we're getting are commercially farmed with machinery, and we're losing that indigenous knowledge. Okay, that has value. Not for everybody, but it's out there. We have these heirloom varieties. We can do direct sale. We know the farmers. Okay, it's organic, the highest quality. It's blessed. We found that 80% of the quinoa almost is blessed by the farmers when they plant it. So they'll do an animal sacrifice. So they'll do a burnt offering to the gods when they plow the land and also when they harvest the land, to thank the gods for giving them good luck and to also recognize their ancestors for looking over them and remembering who they are. For full transparency, this is a bag of quinoa. This actually came from the Brattleboro Food Co-op in 2014 when I first started my study. And I was able to track this bag down to Bolivia, to Juan Pablo Saleme, who owns Quinoa Real, this company. And he exported this product to the United States because he came here and won a pitch competition in his entrepreneurship class and got $1,500 and invested that into creating machinery to be one of the first people to know how to clean quinoa. This was 20 years ago. He went to University of New Hampshire. He got his MBA there. From here, I was able to meet with Juan Pablo, and he looked at the code on this bag that was produced in 2014, November 4th, and he said, oh, I know who that farmer is, and he gave me the farmer's name, and I was able to go out and visit him to start in my quinoa journey. So I'll pass this around if anyone wants to see the original farmer bag. Okay? And so we can continue to do that, right? Thank you. Okay, so that's what's called direct sale, right? Well, you know exactly where it's coming from. And the other thing that we're doing is recognizing the quinoa real, and what we're doing is we're having a minimum producer price of 51 cents a pound, so no more 14 cents, 51 cents. Okay, and it's a 30% increase from today's prices. All right, and there we go. So here's Tanupa, that's the volcano, okay, behind the whole story. And who has questions? All right, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I read about some breweries and distilleries experimenting with quinoa-based whiskeys or vodkas, and I was curious whether you think that has the potential to whether the expansion of that would help Bolivian farmers by expanding the market for quinoa, or hurt them by adding an extra step to the supply chain and reducing the amount of money they earn from on the consumer market?
Yeah, so really good question, right? As people are using quinoa as ingredients in different products, how does that impact the Bolivian producers? And that's actually one of the markets that we're targeting with Perfect Seed, because a lot of the large companies now are working with sustainability firms to help get their supply chains cleaner. And they're looking for these kind of authentic stories and these ingredients that make a difference. So it's actually expanding the market for the farmers. And yeah, there's quinoa whiskey, quinoa vodka, there's quinoa beer. Okay, even in Bolivia, they're producing a lot of these products. There's all kinds of quinoa cereals and noodles and granolas. Yeah, there's a lot of transformation of quinoa. Quinoa milk is a new thing they just came up with in Bolivia, and we're looking at how we can bring that here, because we see a huge market for quinoa milk. Yeah, me.
When you mentioned
And
that
then
you-
George. Yeah.
When you mentioned that you could get involved with that organization, A Perfect Seed, how would you get involved?
So when do you get involved? So we actually have meetings in the Shark Tank right in the basement of this building with all our entrepreneurs get going. And if anyone wants to come by, we have meetings Thursday mornings. Our next meeting is, I believe, on the 23rd. Okay, so if anyone's interested, shoot me an email. I'll send you an invite, and you can definitely come. I've had students come to the meetings before. Some of my marketing students are actually going to work on putting together a marketing campaign for the organization. We'll see what happens. We're talking with investors out in Silicon Valley. There's a big food movement going on there where they're looking at how they can be more sustainable and support sustainable food development. Yeah.
You said it absorbs radiation.
Yeah, so quinoa does absorb radiation. That's why it's growing on Mars right now. They're using it as an experiment. And also the astronauts ate it when they went to the moon back in the 60s, because it has such a high protein content that's easy to pack.
At what rate does it absorb radiation?
I do not know the percentages, but I do know that's important. But again, like, people have been able to adapt the quinoa in other environments, so it doesn't need that so much, but the quinoa in Bolivia needs that to mature. Quinoa is actually related to the beet, and we have it growing around here wild. We call it pigweed sometimes. It grows in our field. It's very tiny. You can eat the leaves. Yeah, the leaves are edible, and the leaves on these quinoa plants are edible too.
What other emerging markets, like with world hunger and everything? I mean, this is such a wonderful, and it is a wonderful product. How is that? How are they trying to get it to other parts of the world?
Yeah, it's kind of a dilemma. You know, the farmers feel bad because, you know, it's a tough situation, right? They feel like they don't want to have their food sovereignty stolen from them. Like, they were the world's biggest tin producers at one point, and that was taken from them. They were the biggest producers of silver, and that was taken from them. The potato was taken from them. So they're one of the largest natural gas producers. They have tremendous lithium reserves. So they're very cautious about their colonization past and things being taken from them, but at the same time, they have compassion for the world. So they've seen the grains being used, for example, in Malawi, where it's been very successful. There was just an international conference on quinoa last week, and they were reporting on the results in Malawi. And in Bolivia, they're able to get yields of 1 ton per hectare, which is about 3 acres. They'll be able to get like 1 to 3 tons, depending on how good they're doing. And in Malawi, they're getting 6 and 7. In China, they're getting 8 and 9. So it's huge. You know, there's no comparison between the yields that are coming out of these other countries using these agro industries, using different varieties of the seeds that could never grow in Bolivia. So it's kind of a catch-22, right? They want to help the world. It grows well in damaged soils with drought, okay, which is where a lot of marginalized populations live and need access to a quality protein. Yeah.
This is a classic agricultural economics situation where when the producer price drops, the retail price doesn't. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious, the co-op that you're developing, are you prepared to drop the retail price when the producer price goes down?
Well, one of the things that we're committing to, so the question was, are we going to follow the market more or less, you know, with pricing? And we've committed to that minimum producer price. And when I talk to the producers, because again, they talk about Bolivianos por quintal, so that's their language of exchange. So 800 Bolivianos por quintal is what everybody said is a just price for them. At that time, the market price was fluctuating between $3.50 and $5.50. But back in the heyday, the highest price that people ever got was $1,200. So when I asked the farmers, what do you need to have a sustainable living? They didn't go to $1,200. They said, no, that was excessive. We knew that was more than what we needed, but what we really need is $800. The fair trade price was put at $5.50. So it wasn't enough. So our commitment is to uphold that threshold of $800, because for 2 years, so that's what the farmers have been asking for. So to answer the question, as consumer prices change, that just depends on how the product is being marketed, right? How it's being transformed, what company you're buying it from, what format. But our base price, we're committed to keeping that stable. Good questions. Yes.
Are the farmers organized nationally in some kind of a way that they can protect themselves?
Yeah, and that's a difficult situation because the government is very distrustful of world markets and doesn't want to support the country getting involved, doesn't want to get involved with economic export activity. And they've really left it to the farmers to do things themselves. So it's a positive and a negative. You don't have a lot of government meddling, but you also don't have a lot of supports and investment. So the farmers themselves have formed very large cooperatives because that's their natural structure of organization. And the government has supported that in bringing back traditional methods of governance and bringing more money to the countryside and more self-determination, but not specifically in the skills that the people need to compete in world markets. So most cooperatives have hundreds of members in them, okay? And together they'll own their own cleaning factory, and together they'll have representatives go to European and USA trade shows, mostly European because it's hard to get visas to come to the United States. And a lot of the European countries will pay also to help the farmers go and attend the trade shows so they can get new business. So in those structures, there's a lot of support, right? And the farmers all pay a percentage of their production to pay for the cost of the operations of the cooperatives, and they're big. They're multi-million-dollar cooperatives. But I was working with the biggest cooperative in Bolivia, and they were still using handwritten spreadsheets. They didn't have a computer. And they were working with millions of dollars of products. So it was really complicated. These are some of my counterparts that I worked with in this project. Yeah.
I know here in the U.S., certain crops are, producers are subsidized to help cope with fluctuating markets and to help cope with fluctuating markets and fluctuating yields depending on if there's a drought or is there anything I wanted to ask if there's anything in the way of that sort of either foreign aid or domestic aid that could help to stabilize the livelihoods of quinoa producers beyond just being sort of at the whim of the market price.
Yeah, and unfortunately, so the question is there any kind of government subsidies or safety nets, right, for the farmers? And the answer is no. The farmers have asked for assistance in the past when there's been droughts, but again, the government is reluctant to step in. The quinoa farmers are not as organized, for example, as the soybean farmers down south, who can very succinctly come into the government offices and say, this is what's going on, this is what we need, this is what's happening with the market, give us this, okay, and have a very cohesive message. They're a bigger industry, the soybean. They're a lot more mechanized, okay, much more educated. It's a totally different culture that's working with soybeans. The quinoa farmers are much more indigenous. They're not as sophisticated in how they present themselves. They're not. Most of them are not college educated. So, and there's many different cooperatives coming from many different regions that want many different things. So they don't present themselves cohesively to the government, and sometimes that works to their disadvantage. Yeah.
You mentioned fertilizer was one of the higher costs.
Yeah.
And they come together to maybe have some kind of llamas producing, some kind of cooperative with llamas to produce their fertilizer that they need.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's really hard. So with the fertilizers, all of this is happening so fast, right? This has just been 3 years, the prices have bombed. So people are now just starting to see, well, what happened? So one of the things is people were using less fertilizer. It was expensive. You have to pay for that up front. You don't just produce quinoa and sell it, right? It takes 9 months to grow it, and it's not sold immediately. So sometimes people hold on to their quinoa. It's not unusual to go to someone's house and they'll have 20 or 30 or 40 bags of quinoa stored in their bathroom, stored in their bedroom, stored in some clean place in their house. Quinoa can store well. You can store it for 7 years and it's good. So people will store their quinoa hoping the price is going to go up. They don't want to sell it when the prices are low. Or maybe there's not an order that came in from Europe because now the buyers are buying from Peru because it's cheaper. Okay, so it's not a continual flow of cash that you can just keep investing. So when it's time to buy the fertilizer, that's when the farmers often have the least amount of money. So they've been trying to skimp on that, and they found that that affects the yields. But it's a gamble because also you can fertilize your fields very well and then have an early frost come in or hail, and that can destroy your yields. Or you can have a drought, and that's going to destroy your yields. Okay, so when I was there, I was observing about a 30% loss in production because of those 3 different things, and it's really hard to predict or control for any of them. Yeah, someone who hasn't asked a question yet? Okay, go ahead.
I'm curious, Dr. Stenn, whether you have looked at how much, by what percentage they would have to cut their production in order to raise the price to cover their costs.
Well, the problem is, so the question is, how can they reduce that supply, right, to build that demand so that they can get more money for their quinoa? But the problem is that everybody else is already producing it, so they become irrelevant. Unless they're marketing themselves as Royal Quinoa, which is where nobody else can compete. And what happened is the Andean nations and the European community have recognized that Royal Bolivian quinoa that's only grown in a 50-mile radius around the salt flats has a distinct cultural, biological, economical difference, where like champagne can only come from grapes from Champagne, France. The same thing, Royal Quinoa can only come from the shores of the salt flats. But it costs money to market that message, right? And again, it costs sophistication, it costs cultural knowledge. And the Bolivians don't necessarily have that background of knowing how do you get into a world market and create some value for this thing called Royal Quinoa when no one knows what it is. So that's a problem that they have. So right now their quinoa is sold on the market with everyone else, and Peru sets the prices. Anything else? Yes?
Never mind. I was just wondering also when you were talking about them not having as much success organizing to sort of these days in the U.S. lobby sounds like a dirty word, but to lobby the Bolivian government for those subsidies, for that support that the soybean farmers are getting. Mm-hmm. I was curious whether you think there are is any potential for charity work on that behalf, on behalf of sort of legal and political sort of support for the quinoa producers in that area.
Yeah. So the question is there anyone supporting, right, the further production or the further designation or recognition of what's happening with the Bolivian quinoa growers? And sometimes foreign countries might invest in a particular program, a leadership program, help provide the cost for the legal fees, for example, to develop. And you can develop a certificate of origin, but then you need to defend it. Okay, I don't know if anyone remembers when Italy started to say that we can't make New York-style pizza because it's taking away their cultural heritage of pizza and that we're doing it all wrong here, and they took it to the world courts, and they lost. Right? But to do that's expensive, right? You have to have watchdogs out there and know what's going on. And, there's been other times the sparkling wine in California, that was something that was starting to become champagne, and that was fought, and California lost. And now it's called sparkling wine. It's not called California champagne, which is what they were trying to call it. So to have these kind of protections, you have to know how to enforce them. And it's expensive. Okay, so sometimes countries might help out. I've seen it work more like on the embassy level, like the embassy will pay for a program. But once the quinoa boom ended, all the development money went to other countries, and Africa suddenly became the biggest place of need. And a lot of the agronomers and engineers, they're out there, the soil scientists, they all left. And even the national programs that were set up ended, and even the universities stopped taking notice of what was happening in the quinoa fields. So it's hard to keep that national attention as different changes come up and interests kind of shift. Okay, I think this is going to be our last question. Yeah.
I was wondering what you think is needed to educate, people say in the United States. I think in Europe people are more savvy, but as to the benefit of paying for the real royal quinoa and the recognition that it's something special. It seems like it's an education. It's something that people need to know about, and how can that happen, or
Yeah, so how do we educate people on what royal quinoa is? Well, that gets to be the class project for my global marketing students. Yay! So you guys get to figure that out. And one of the answers is social media is amazing at being able to share information and really get messages out there and have those stories. Like I took pictures of you guys because the farmers want to know what's going on. I can call a farmer right now from this room and introduce them to you guys. We're in communication that fast. So there's a lot of ways now that we're able to really get these messages out, but it has to, there needs to be an effort, right? Some work that's put in it, but there's definitely methods to share that information, and people are interested, so that's a good thing. Cool? All right.
Thank you so much for coming. If you have